The importance of addressing the climate change emergency has never been clearer. At the School of Geographical and Earth Sciences here at the University of Glasgow, postgraduate students are at the forefront of research into understanding the impact of climate change and informing possible pathways to sustainable future.
COP, or the Conference of Parties, brings together 197 nations and territories that have signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, a treaty agreed in 1994, whose objective is to stabilize the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system.
For the first time, the UK will host the 26th meeting, COP26, in Glasgow on the 1st to the 12th of November 2021.
These climate talks will be the biggest international summit the UK has never hosted, bringing together heads of state, climate experts, young people, civil society, trade unions, faith groups, and indigenous people to agree coordinated action to tackle climate change.
In my PhD, I'm looking at the changes that go on across our coasts in the short term and looking to predict the changes that may occur with the result of storms. My research is now looking at using satellite imagery to extract shorelines automatically by looking at that kind of top-down view of a coast and drawing the line along the water's edge to be able to build up a full evidence base of shoreline change over the past that can be updated every week. The changes that are occurring across our coasts are happening at an increased rate and are having more adverse effects against our assets at the coast and our communities at the coast, enhancing the vulnerability of these coastal communities to erosion and to flooding and to damage of assets. It's absolutely intrinsically linked with climate change. Our sea levels across, globally, but also specifically in Scotland, have been rising for the last 50 years, but it has increased exponentially in the last decade or so and will continue to increase as our climate changes. Some communities are at risk more than others, and that is partly what my research will be able to help with, is identifying where exactly those at-risk areas are and where exactly we will be facing problems in the near future with upcoming storms. Just as coastal erosion across Scotland's coast is changeable and spatially variable, so too is our social deprivation and our social vulnerability to that coastal erosion. If we're able to arm ourselves with that information ahead of an adverse weather event and extreme water levels, then we can make the proper preparations and we can make the proper decisions that will help our communities that are at risk to become more resilient.
My PhD research is on the vulnerability and susceptibility of the Nigerian coast to climate change-induced hazard. Specifically, I'm looking at coastal erosion because it's one of the climate change hazard that has been understudied in Africa. Climate change doesn't just affect areas with high carbon emission, even areas that have, low or zero carbon emission, like most of the developing areas in Africa. We are made to understand that human activities actually has accelerated climate change. And this is the awareness that most of the people in the developing nations don't know that. So the research is actually to highlight, one, there's adverse impact also in these developing nations, and then two, also to create awareness among the people living in this coastal environment on how to prepare to adapt or mitigate climate change impacts. Most of the mangroves, which are actually the plants that help protect the coast, these plants have been cut down for commercial purposes, building, their houses and all that. So because they lack the understanding that this is actually what is preserving them. When I went to the field in 2018, 2 days after I left the field, there was a serious storm, and the storm eroded all the houses in the area, and 8 lives were lost that night. Over 50 houses were eroded. Hopefully that this research will create awareness to those in the community on the impact, of climate change, and also the awareness on the consequences of what their actions are and their contributions to this impact, and then also help them develop more policies on the resilience and then how to adapt and mitigate this climate change, which is peculiar to their own environment, because it's important to know that what may work in other developed nations it may not be the same thing there. It's not peculiar with them. So that's why the community engagement is really, really important.
My research is about mangrove biomass estimation using satellite imagery. Mangroves normally situate at the subtropical and tropical coast regions. My study site is located at the southern part of China, at my hometown, Zhanjiang, China. The largest mangrove forest exists there. Mangrove that has a very complex root system that act high over the water. Thanks to this complex root system, mangrove act as a depot center for carbon, for sediment, and other elements to capture more carbon. So mangroves is very important to alleviate the impact of climate change. Mangroves nowadays are threatened by human activity, just such as coastal development, and also mangroves are threatened by climate changes, which result in sea level rise and extreme weather events. My research is using the satellite imagery to estimate the biomass because mangroves are very hard to access. Currently, there are many mangrove restoration plans, but there is rare research to review how these restoration plans work. The policymaker or the stakeholders of the restoration will benefit from my research, and it is expected that they can carry out more reasonable or feasible restoration plans to the mangrove.
My research is on coral reefs. I specifically look at metabolism of coral reefs and carbon cycling on coral reefs in the Caribbean region. My particular area of research right now is biogeochemistry, so I'm looking at the carbon cycle on coral reefs and looking at the scale of a coral organism, an individual, right up to the ecosystem scale. And by looking at it through these different scales, you can answer lots of different questions about how the ecosystem is functioning and how we can slow down their degradation and how we can help them to recover. Coral reefs are important for hundreds of millions of people worldwide. We've lost 50 to 90% of the corals around different regions of the Caribbean. The coral reef structure can absorb up to 90% of the wave action from storms. So as we see our climate changing, we're seeing increased storm frequency and severity. Coral reefs are more important than ever to protect coastlines. Aside from that, coral reefs are highly biodiverse. They house about a third of all marine species. And so as we lose coral reefs, we're also losing that biodiversity, and we're seeing reductions locally and globally in some of the organisms that live on coral reefs. My research looks at the calcification and the photosynthesis that's taking place on a coral reef. By understanding these really fundamental physiological processes that are taking place, we can understand and predict what is going to happen to coral reefs as the climate is changing. Without the information that I'm trying to generate through my PhD and working with other scientists who are working on this, it's quite hard for us to understand exactly how climate change is going to affect coral reefs. We know it's not going to be good, but quantifying exactly what is going to happen depends upon this fundamental understanding of the balance of processes that are taking place on a coral reef.
I'm researching blue carbon storage in Greenland's fjords. Blue carbon is the carbon that is captured and stored by the world's oceans and marine ecosystems, and it's captured through biological processes such as photosynthesis and calcification, and then it gets deposited and stored on the seafloor, and it's stored in the sediment, and it can remain here for long timescales. And there's evidence that at high latitudes there are significant quantities of this blue carbon that's stored. However, we don't yet understand how that might change in the future under climate change and land use change. So my research is looking at quantifying current and historic rates and mechanisms of carbon burial and remineralization under different land use and climate change. And this will help us to explore the future potential capacity of Greenland's fjords to act as an efficient carbon sink in a changing world. So I'll be going out to Greenland and collecting some sediment cores, and I'll be using techniques such as mass spectrometry, isotope stable analysis, and radiocarbon dating, and I'll be looking at the rates and mechanisms of carbon storage within these sediment cores. So this research might help to inform governments on the implementation of management and protection strategies, and this is really vital because These blue carbon stores, if they're unprotected from threats or disturbances such as trawling or development, these ecosystems can actually emit carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere, so they become a source of carbon as opposed to a sink of carbon.
I research paleoclimates. This is past climates. I look at a time in the past when the climate changed really quickly. In the UK, this was about 15,000 years ago, when we were coming out of the last glacial period and into a warm period that we're currently in. This time period is particularly interesting to look at because there were large changes in atmospheric circulation, temperature, environmental change, and large changes to the vegetation as well. It's the last time that the climate changed very quickly under like natural forcings. So there wasn't any human influence, and looking at this time gives us a baseline for like how the climate behaves. This is a lake sediment core taken from Bardawi Loch, which is just 12 miles north of Glasgow. You can see from the colour change, these were deposited in a cold period, and this darker sediment here was deposited where it's warmer. We have to put in real data to models to get them to predict the future. So past climate data is used to like validate the models. The main thing we hope to find out are what the rates of change naturally are and like the magnitude of change as well. We've already found out that there's been like a 5-degree increase in temperature between the last glacial period and the warmer period now. So like without human influence, we've already seen that like that type of change, that magnitude is possible. So the climate system does have the ability to change really quickly and like drastically as well.
I'm here researching vulnerability assessment of climate change in Liberia. West Africa, which Liberia is part of, is prone to climate change vulnerability. It has been affecting the country, most especially the agricultural sector. Counties that were once considered as the food basket of the country, they used to be producing more food crops. But because of the changes of climate change, there have been some reduction of food production. And even though there is no report indicating that Liberia has once observed drought, there is an imminent projection that in the long run, there will be something like a drought in the future. So the essence of this, my research will be, I'll be able to look at the historical pattern of rainfall and temperature data from 1981 to 2000, which I will also use to project for the next 40 years to know whether there will be some drought that will really emerge in the country. Africa as a whole, or specifically in Liberia, about 70% of the population depends on agriculture. Okay, and if that has some problems, that it will lead much of the population vulnerable, because if they cannot really produce food as a result of climate variability, definitely you expect people that are involved in agriculture to be vulnerable. So what is required for us to do is, once some of those things are identified and we are able to determine the strategy, the adaptation mechanism, we can be able to at least come up with some policy that will be able to safeguard the population that will be affected by this drought.
I believe the time to act is now, and all hands should be on deck in tackling climate change challenges.